Last week, I asked everyone what you think our greatest challenge is in the world. And I'm asking, what do you think our greatest challenge is as a species? What is the greatest challenge facing the human race today? And just think about that before you answer it, because you might find that the answer is not quite the same as what at least I would be proposing here as the simple but difficult answer. So just to follow that train of thought rather than just answer it, here we have a very often cited quote from Albert Einstein, which I've called the logic of human evolution, which is that if we can agree with Einstein's statement that we cannot solve current and future problems with the thinking that created them, these problems, then we must find something different. We then must or can also agree, if we agree with the previous statement, and this is the logic, that to become a regenerative, resilient, and sustainable society, we must be willing to suspend every and all past ways of thinking and doing that no longer serve us. Again, that is a simple statement, very difficult to actually accomplish. How do we reinvent the human race? If we realize, as this is my contention and from my research, I have found that this seems to be quite true, is that every human institution and system is deeply flawed, is profoundly flawed, or is in trouble, and is not providing us with the regenerative, resilient, equitable, prosperous society that I believe, at least those of us who are in this course and in this program, want. If we're going to do that, we need to redefine who we are. We can't just begin to focus on behaviors, because we are, of course, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. But if we're Homo sapiens, how is it that we've reached this particular point in our history? So Homo sapiens means wise man, and if we're going to be gender equitable, wise people. But I also contend or argue that most of the trouble we're in really does depend on the men who have brought it to this position or this place in history. So what is the response to this? What is different, or something that we need to discover or explore that's different from Homo sapiens? And that, of course, is in the regenerative leadership framework, in the sustainability change agent self-assessment. And that is the imperative that we must begin to think in systems again. We must go back to, I've called it Homo systemicus, but before, anybody who lived on this earth without the technology we have today made decisions, and every decision actually meant the difference between living or dying. A good decision was a matter of survival. And of course, indigenous populations, and some of you have actually brought up this idea of indigenous wisdom in the forums this week and in your comments. This notion of the Iroquois Native Americans of thinking 7 generations down the road in terms of the consequences of the decisions we make as a tribe or as a clan, as a village, we have lost that capacity to see the consequences of our actions. This is something we need to work on. And as we get towards the regenerative leadership framework, you'll see how that works. So this has implications. It has implications about redefining what we do at the local level, all the way up to the global level. So as Andrew was saying, the important thing, and others of you this week have also said, our work is local. The cumulative impact is global, but we cannot solve global problems from a global perspective unless you are the United Nations, and they have not been able to do a very good job of this themselves, even though we have the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is something about the power and of the individual at the local level and the local community, the local school and the local project that's extremely powerful, which allows us to move away from linear systems of operation, this whole notion of extracting what we want from the earth transforming that by producing products and services and then using them and throwing them away in this linear model, not what Bill McDonough mentioned, as I mentioned before, the cradle to cradle model, where we actually, everything that we make becomes something new again, as good as or better than what we had before, and it is not contaminated with toxic substances that we have created. And this is what Gregory Unruh calls the take, make, waste society, where we go from natural capital, manufacture, and then after we consume, we toss away, we throw away, rather than recycle or even upcycle, as Bill McDonough actually proposes. So we need to go from the linear systems that we have in operation today, based on the Industrial Revolution, the scientific method and rationalism, to integrated systems again, where we follow in our industrial cycle, our technical cycle, the same cycles as the natural cycle. So those of you who have been working with cyclical economies or cluster industries, these are attempts at getting back to seeing how every industry, for example, in this case, actually helps the neighboring industry, because my waste, if I produce something, becomes your raw materials, your natural resource to transform into another product. And your waste then feeds another industry or another business. And this integrated system is that systems thinking that we must expand upon and deepen if we are to really create a human species that can survive over the next 100, 200 years and into the future. So the question is, how do we go from this, which many propose as well, we do all of these things, we reduce the use of natural resources, products in the office, materials in school, we reuse stuff, we recycle paper, we recycle waste, we actually reduce our use of water and energy. We're doing a good job. However, this is not enough, particularly with 7.5 billion people on the planet. So the question is, how do we go from here to here? This is the challenge. How can we restore the damage we've done? That is, how can we create a healthy natural, a social and economic system, redesign everything that we do, and replace the old systems with new ones? And that is a challenge for all of us. And that is the challenge, of course, that I propose for you as you go building your own project for the regenerative solution, whether it's an education program, a campaign, a new business, an NGO, a community organization, a village, a government, or a city, a town, whatever it is, a hospital. How can you apply this cyclical model to everything that you do? So for that, we need to have a theory of change. And that theory of change for me is this. It is clear that our behaviors are what make change happen. But behaviors can only be as good as what I call the inner operating system that drives them. And we talked about this last week. What is that inner operating system? Like a computer, we and our inner operating system is, of course, our human consciousness, which again is a topic that people find very hard to actually focus on, because it requires stepping away from everything that we do to rethink everything that we are in order to redesign who we are before we can redesign what we do. So this is that requirement of that redefinition of our mindset to refocus on the inner operating system before we can restore what is happening now and redesigning the future. And this goes back to Einstein's phrase about we cannot solve the problems we have today with the thinking that created those problems. And this is what I call the journey of evolutionary wisdom. And let me show you what I mean by that. This particular journey has two phases, and it all has to do with purpose and purposes. And what I mean by that, I mean that in our individual obeying or responding to the purposes of others. That is eternal purpose. Our parents who tell us what is good for us, what we should be doing in our lives, what we should study. People, our bosses who tell us what we need to do, how we need to do it. The people we love, not allowing us to be ourselves, to become ourselves. That external purpose I call the regressive cycle. And it kicks in a cycle which goes backwards. It does not evolve. And it certainly is not wise. And that cycle looks like this. If we are unaware, we're ignorant of our own purpose, of course, we are like this. We're wandering in the wilderness. We don't know where we're going, what we want, and why we want it. And of course, we are vulnerable to other people coming and helping us define our purposes. Of course, if somebody does that and we don't like what they tell us, we resist. And that is what we call resistance to change, which again is a myth for me. Resistance to change occurs when a leader is incapable of telling his or her followers why the change that he or she is proposing is so much better than the place that you are in now. So resistance to change for me is a fairly simple equation, and we can talk about that later or in the forum. But beyond resistance, once resistance has been overcome by the external factor, the people outside of your own purpose, then you accept, sometimes with resignation, because you have nothing better to put in its place. And in the end, you become compliant. And many of our systems, our governments, our regulations, our education system, our financial systems are based on the idea that it's fundamental for these organizations to be successful, for all of us to be compliant, to obey. And that is the regressive cycle that actually does not allow us to build a life of real purpose that can actually transform not only our own reality, but the reality of others. But what happens when you do connect to something that drives you? And if you are in this course and in this program, it is because you are connected to something stronger and driving that is actually speaking to you about doing something to make a difference. And that is what I call the evolutionary cycle. When the evolutionary cycle kicks in, everything that was pulling you down into compliance disappears. And what happens there is suddenly, instead of being unaware resistant, you have an intention. You have this powerful drive to do something which is true to you. That intention actually gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you to engage in that purpose in order to actually do something important. Sometimes, hopefully, more important than you. And that engagement is empowering. That empowerment is actually what allows us to continue working the hard work, even when the going gets difficult. But the end of that process and that cycle is fulfillment. And we might call that in different ways: success, prosperity, love, whatever it is that makes meaning, gives meaning to our lives, that is fulfillment. And that, of course, is an evolutionary cycle, something that we are continually seeking to do, and hopefully in the best of ways. And it's not necessary for us to believe that we have one single purpose in our lives. There may be many, but in the end, all of this actually drives us towards building what I've called, and many of us call, our legacy. What is it that you want to be remembered for? What is it that you're going to leave behind that will have made that difference? And this is not something that anybody else can do for us. We have to do it ourselves, for ourselves. And that is the journey that we must all go on in order to accomplish that legacy in our lives. So at this time of the presentation, what I normally do is I ask people just to sit quietly and think about themselves where they are right now. And if you're watching the recording, do the same. Take a minute just to sit quietly and think. Not about now, but now project yourself to the end of your life. And imagine yourself dying or having just died and surrounded by the people who you have lived and worked with, your family, your colleagues, your friends, people who have respected you, that you've been connected with over your life. And then ask yourself, what is it that they are saying about you? Listening on that conversation. What do they have to say about your life and what you are leaving behind? And think about, as you listen to that conversation, are they saying what you would like them to say? And if they're not saying that, what is it that you would like them to say? And what is it that you would like your children, your family, your friends, your colleagues, your co-workers, whoever they are that are there, what would you want them to be saying about you at that moment when you are moving on and leaving something behind? And as you think about what you would like them to say, come back to the present moment and actually think about what is it that you would like to do today, right now, about yourself and who you are, in how you connect to everybody else and yourself, and what you do yourself and with others. That is the beginning of that legacy that you'll be building over the next 10, 15, 20, or 50 years. And if you allow yourself that space every day to reflect on how you are building that legacy in yourself and with others, then I can guarantee that your evolutionary wisdom will be a very completely different journey to others, to that of others. And that's where we come to the regenerative leadership framework that actually provides, I would say, a scaffolding, a structure in order to get to that legacy. And this is the product of my research and consulting work with businesses, nonprofit organizations, community, government officials, higher education and K-12 education leaders and teacher leaders. So a number of people who have shared with me their insights about what we've called regenerative leadership, going beyond sustainability, and what it is that actually has allowed them to be highly effective as regenerative leaders. So you'll see that the framework actually has 4 quadrants. And I borrowed the 4 quadrants from Ken Wilber, an American philosopher who lives in Boulder, Colorado, who had developed this framework of the all quadrants, all levels, and the theory of everything, and other works of Ken Wilber. For those of you who want to go deeper, I would highly recommend it. Another person that I've actually based a lot of my work on is Otto Scharmer at MIT, and Theory U, and his more recent work now in actually envisioning emerging futures. But I'll get back to that. So why 4 quadrants? Well, these 4 quadrants actually represent 4 distinct dimensions of the human experience. Below the surface, we have the interior or the subjective world of individuals and the collective. Above the surface, we have the external world of objects, of behaviors, of society. So these are the 2 dimensions, again, of the individual and the collective. So as we go through the framework, I'll explain what each of these quadrants has and the other elements that make it up. But between the upper level of the objective world, the inner level of the subjective world, is what I call the field of emerging consciousness and empowerment. And this is what Otto Scharmer calls the Eingang. This field, which is the humus or the soil, the nutritional earth, where our consciousness actually emerges into the world of behavior. So this soil is what actually we as regenerative leaders actually make fertile so that wonderful things may emerge from it. And what Thich Nhat Hanh, a very famous Buddhist, calls, if you have great soil or a great garden, what is it you would want to share with your friends and your family? Would it be weeds, or would you want to share fruits, flowers, and vegetables? So our job as leaders is not to tell people what to do, but to help provide the nutrition for that soil to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the consciousness of each individual, so that they themselves may empower themselves to become who they should become. And how do we do that? Well, leader, you see here in the bottom left, in the personal mindset, purpose, and worldview, the regenerative leader. And what are these elements of the qualities of consciousness? One is that awakening to that heightened sense of purpose. We have found something that makes a lot of sense, that gives our lives meaning, whether it's sustainability or anything else. It might be art, but then we connect art to sustainability, or education, and we connect that to regeneration, or community organizing, or entrepreneurship, or politics. There is nothing in the human experience that cannot provide a sense of heightened purpose, as if this is what we were here to do. The problem is how we do it. So other qualities of the regenerative leader is creative intelligence. This idea that we cannot just continue thinking in the old ways. We have to come together as individuals and as a collective and really encourage creativity. Without that, we cannot actually find new solutions to the old problems. In order to do that, we need to be able to be well-versed in systems thinking, which is something we'll explore more next week in other frameworks and tools. Global ethics is another fundamental quality which we all have, but we don't always meet. By global ethics, I mean there is nothing wrong with all individuals having the particular individual interests, needs, aspirations, and goals. But those needs and goals and aspirations cannot be left to expand unchecked without considering the common good. Global ethics is how I balance my self-interest with the common interest, with the global need or the global rights to everything, to access. And all of this cannot work if I cannot have as an individual the sense that I cannot work in the idea of just the short term. As you were working a project, the short term has to be expanded to the long term. When we talk regeneration, we need to think about 200 years in the future, not less than 50, certainly not 3 months or a year. The human race actually works along the term generations, decades and millennia, centuries and millennia. We cannot go back to shareholder management and quarterly reports. These are not sustainable. So the emerging future of as a quality of the regenerative leader is fundamental, being able to create a vision of an ideal future very much in the future. And then we'll see how we accomplish that. So these mindset components are actually translated in the regenerative leader in behaviors as an individual. And of course, if you have a strong sense of purpose, then your leadership will be purpose-driven. And that purpose will be a high level of purpose, based on ethics, based on a noble and a purposeful vision, which has sustainability as one of its key principles, environmental, economic, and social, but also the well-being of the planet as a whole over the long term. But in order to become a purpose-driven leader, you also need to understand that you cannot learn to be an expert leader if you cannot understand how other people are doing things better than you are. And in order to do that, you have to be able to be humble enough to observe those who are doing things better and to learn from them. That requires you and all of us to be able to deeply listen to each other. And again, I'll be talking about generative dialogue next week, about how we actually reach the capacity to listen deeply to one another without any filters, without judgment. And in order to do that, we have to be able to engage multiple stakeholders, not just our friends or people who look like us, but people who receive the impacts of what we do, our clients, the indirect members of the community with whom we're not even connected, we don't think, until we realize that everything that we do has consequences and affects everything else in the universe. And that is what we call in quantum physics and mechanics, the butterfly effect, that everything that we think, everything that we do affects everything else in the universe. And that is a very powerful thought and challenge for us to be very, very ethical and purposeful and mindful as we make decisions in our behaviors. The next quadrant, and you'll see the next quadrant is down here, number 3, is not a cross. Why? Because as I said before, regenerative leaders don't tell people what to do. Actually foster the collectives through this generative dialogue or conversation. And that generative dialogue actually is not about selling my vision to a group of people or telling people how great it would be to become sustainable. It's actually engaging in an open conversation in order to figure out together what is our vision, our collective vision, and our collective purpose going forward. And this brings in two very important concepts. They were big words, but easy to understand. One is the notion of transconceptual dynamics. The human race, and many of us, when we work, we are stuck in using only reason and logic to solve our problems. And if we look at history carefully, it is reason and logic that have created the problems that we have today. Yes, we have fantastic results in technology and science, in some cases, and economics, but also we have the unintended consequences, which are very negative, which are actually bringing our species to the brink of disaster or even extinction. So what do we mean by transconceptual dynamics? What it means going beyond conceptual. In our meetings, are we able to value emotions? Are we able to value intuition, imagination, and the creativity that I was talking about here, this creative intelligence of the collective wisdom that is not rooted in logic and reason, but comes from somewhere else, which I call that spark of inspiration. These are all human faculties that unfortunately in some work environments particularly, these are not allowed, they are discouraged. And these may be the human faculties and the intelligences that can actually bring us the solutions or the ideas of the solutions that we cannot find in our spreadsheets and in our scorecards and in our measurement of data and quantitative data and trying to save 10% of our waste or improving 3% in our carbon emissions. All of this logical work is actually burning out sustainability professionals. We need to find a different way of doing things. We do that by engaging triple loop learning. Again, complicated term that is quite simple. Single loop learning is actually the learning that happens on the assembly line in a factory. That learning is we build a car, we make a product, at the end of the assembly line, that car comes off the assembly line, goes on to the test track, the wheels fall off, we realize we didn't do a good job, we learn the lesson, we put the wheels back on, we go back to that stage, that phase in the assembly cycle, we improve, we train that person, we go through it again, but the system is working fine. That is single loop learning. Double loop learning is when we begin to challenge, why are we doing things this way? Isn't there a better way to do this? And therefore, we actually begin to do things like customized assembly. Toyota and particularly Lexus, you can actually build your own car on order. Dell does the same thing with computers. You can actually design your own computer through Dell by ordering it how you want it. That is more of double loop learning. It also goes into challenging the whys we're doing things, and therefore it challenges the values. But triple loop learning goes further. Triple loop learning is based on the premise that the realization that everything that we're doing is flawed. We may need to consider the need to start all over again in redesigning every human system and operation in order to create a society that is more equitable, environmentally sustainable, financially prosperous, and that can live and prosper over the next 1,000 or 10,000 years with the same quality of life as we have today, or even, obviously, even better. So how does the collective behave? Because this is the equivalent to the individual consciousness. This is the collective consciousness that we as regenerative leaders try to instill or nurture in our organizations or our institutions or schools. So how do we behave? Well, the behaviors of the collective are, one is this idea of backcasting. If you're not familiar with this, or reverse engineering, it's the idea of what is the ideal end state, such as sustainability. In 100 or 200 years, what do we see as the ideal condition in which we want to be living as a species and as a planet? And then we strategically plan backwards from that future to the present by saying, what do we need to do in year 199, 190, 150, 150, and this month and next year. So instead of just creating a strategic plan and seeing what happens, we create an ideal future and then create a strategic plan backwards without the unintended consequences that will inevitably happen when we project a prototype into the future without considering all of these consequences well into that desirable future. This is what we call third order change, where we are using this triple loop learning of the transconceptual dynamic to build this collective strategy where we actually prototype a solution, work out all the kinks, thinking about what will this look like 200 years in the future, and then once we've tested that prototype, we can begin to mainstream it, that is to scale it up, in order to try and accomplish that triple top line, which, as I said last week, is how can we grow prosperity, celebrate community, and ensure the health of all species for all time. So what other elements come together in the framework? Well, one is that regenerative leadership is purpose-driven, it's shared, and it's iterative, it is never ending. That's the reason for the infinity symbol. This never ends. We never finish learning how to be regenerative leaders. The other aspect of it, this is the internal aspect. The external aspect is how do we work? How do we make decisions? And this is what brings in that idea of the circular systems of collaboration, where authority is horizontal, not top down. We as regenerative leaders do not tell people how things will happen. We bring people together, and together we design solutions. Therefore, in the project, in order to design the solution, you must get your client at the design table before you start. So if you're going to build a community center with disability access, you must get people who have disabilities to sit at the table and tell you why this center will not work and what it needs to have in order to provide access to people with particular disabilities, or if they're blind, or if they're mobility impaired and therefore have to move around in wheelchairs, or if they're deaf, or if they don't have limbs. So the design stage, and we'll be talking more about this technically next week, is critically important for the circular system of collaboration to kick in. You might want to explore the work of Frederic Laloux and reinventing organizations, and particularly his description of teal organizations and how they work in this idea of the self-organizing, co-creating approaches to business, education, healthcare, industry, even in multinational corporations where there is no positional authority. The authority is given to the person who is an expert at the moment of the conversation. And we can talk about that later, and you can read about it more, or you can email me questions about this. So going forward, I'm going to leave you with a very simple equation. Regeneration is inversely proportional to E. The question to us all is, what does E represent? And I'll let you think about that a little minute. Again, it's a very simple answer again. This is the most difficult challenge that as a human species we have to face if we are going to be successful going forward into the future. And actually, as it says in the Brunt report, being able to meet our own needs and ensuring that future generations can meet their own needs. So regeneration, as I said, is inversely proportional to ego. This is, unfortunately, the most difficult challenge that we have as individuals, and then as organizations and communities. Pride is our undoing. As soon as it is about me, or it's about the people I represent, then at the design table, I have an interest. I cannot let go of my ego sufficiently to allow the project to be more important than me, my self-interest, or the people that I represent. If I'm a politician, the mayor of a city, if I'm the CEO of a company and I have shareholders, if it's very difficult to, if I have run an NGO and I have victims of a disaster, I have to defend my interest, and that makes it very difficult for me and the people around a table to be able to design a regenerative solution, because what my imperative is, I have to go back and make money or save people's lives, and therefore I cannot think 200 years down the road. This is the real juggling problem and challenge for regenerative leaders. How can I balance the urgent needs of today with the long-term consequences of our actions? And these inevitably will come to roost. They will come and affect everything that we do. And therefore, one of the people in my research actually said, we have to be able to check, that is to leave our egos and our logos, our positions, our titles at the door. At the design table, there is nobody better than anybody else. When we actually create a sustainable building, the janitor who is actually managing the cleaning products and water must be at the management table, because he or she knows better than anybody else how to create a healthy environment for people who actually work or live in that building. So we need to think about everybody needs to be at the design table. So as you go forward into designing your project, whatever that is, think about these things and come back to the framework and make sure that you are actually using these elements to think about how you want to build your particular legacy.